Thank you so much. Just make sure our slide's up. So really a pleasure to be here today, even though I just flew in this morning. So if my voice cracks, it's because of lack of sleep. As we know, within the climate context, mitigating emissions, particularly from the energy sector, is of critical importance. And one of the most important strategies for that, of course, is to take advantage of local domestic renewable resources. And so what we'd like to do here is really focus in on how does one take advantage of renewable resources in a way to inform policy, inform decisions, and how critical is it to think about the data that's involved in doing that and the quality of the data. And so here I'm just going to give about 10 minutes worth of very quick overview of thinking about data and understanding how data quality is very, very important to this decision-making process. And here you see in this first graph, of course, the number of countries which have committed to or have goals in renewable energy. They're the ones highlighted in blue, and it's well more than 150 or so now. And on the upper left-hand side, you see an incredible growth in renewable energy capacity additions. In fact, more than 100 gigawatts was installed last year. That's equivalent of, if you think in other terms, maybe 200 or 300 large power plants, like a coal plant, or 100 what would be traditional nuclear plants. Each year is being built by renewables, mostly wind, solar, still existing hydro and continued hydro and biomass itself. And maybe more importantly, within the context of this conversation, is what's captured in the right-hand slide, the little graph at the top, where you see the blue and the red and the green and the yellow. That's the projection that actually came out of the International Energy Agency in terms of the anticipated growth in renewable energy between now and 2040 under the INDCs. And that growth will lead from renewable energy, where it is today, to almost 50% of global electricity production. And that's fairly significant. And so the real question is what data do you need in order to do that right and to do it economically in the best way possible? So the next slide, please, if you would. So data really is at the center of a decision process. And that process is not just linear, it continues and it evolves. And I'm going to show some examples of how this goes forward in terms of informing goal setting, which you can do very rigorously in terms of looking at scenarios and looking at least cost economic modeling. Of course, all of that built up from very high quality data. And then from that, you can also look in detail of how do you formulate policies that would take advantage of or support the evolution, particularly of the power sector, but also energy access and the other services which are derived from clean energy as well. That then leads to very rigorous power sector planning. We all appreciate reliable, affordable, secure power, and that's a very important element, be it either in a rural setting or in this setting here. And so understanding how renewables integrate into that system is very critical. And of course, the project development side is absolutely critical, because that's really where the private sector comes into play. They need to know data in rigorous detail in order to make those projects bankable, and we'll hear quite a bit about that. And so you can see the scales are also different. I mean, it goes from hours to years and years to decades, and so we have to think all across that. And of course, the goal here is increased renewable energy, well-informed policy decisions that lead to greenhouse gas reductions. Have the next slide, please. So I'm going to show a couple examples here, and we're going to use our the country of the Philippines just to show the quality of the data. And here I show 3 slides, one of biomass, one of wind. Very specifically, we're going to talk more about wind, and one of solar. The resolutions are different, and I think what's most important to think about on this slide is that renewables are different as an energy source. So when we think traditionally about energy, it tends to come from a source, and that source then is transported somewhere else, or the energy is, either by truck, by rail, or by wire. And most importantly to think about from renewables is that they're site-specific. They're location-specific, and you may have multiple renewable resources in any given location. And so you may be able to develop, for example, wind on a given site in combination with solar and in combination with bio. So they're not mutually exclusive either, and so you can see very rigorously here where those resources are, and I'll get into some more detail as well, and I think it's really important to understand, again, geospatial resolution as well as the temporal resolution. So many of us know or understand that renewables are, or at least wind and solar, are variable, and so you have to understand the temporal variability as well. Next slide, please. Sorry, the next slide, thank you. Also importantly, I put this slide up, this shows the evolution of the size of wind turbines since about mid-1990s. And the point here is not to show just a cute cartoon of wind size growth, but it's really to understand that there's a tight marriage between technology innovation and the quality of the resource information. And so, for example, in 1995, if we were measuring the wind at about 50 meters height, which is the height of the wind hub in 1995, that would be appropriate for 1995 turbines. But if we were to measure the wind speed at 50 meters hub height today for an onshore wind turbine or an offshore wind turbine, that would be at the wrong height, because those turbine heights are now 100, 120 meters. And so it's very important to have the accurate data at the right resolution and of course, at the right height for wind in particular. So if we have the next slide. So here I want to just highlight a bit about wind in some more detail, and I want to hone down the message here about using the right data and how important it is. And so here you see, just very briefly, two country-level wind maps, one at 30 meters hub height and one at 100 meters hub height. So the left-hand side is 30 meters, the right-hand side is 100. And while a little bit hard to see from the back, you can see that as you increase the hub height, as you would expect if you think about how wind actually is constrained by being closer to ground, the wind speed actually increases. And so if you click one more time, we're going to see that in some more detail. So here we've just blown up one region, and so the top graph shows that region at 30 meters, and the bottom graph in the middle shows that same region at 100 meters. And you can see a pretty stark difference. And so if I were to provide, for example, a policymaker the 30-meter hub height map and say, well, you have some wind resources here, and it doesn't look like very much, and it may be not very economic, that would be a very misleading place to start. And so what you want to do is be very, very careful and say, well, for today's development, we need to look at 100 meters, and frankly, that map is very, very different. In fact, in that small region of the country, there is more than 10 times the wind development capacity than is installed in the Philippines, all their power. And for the country itself, it's more than 100 times or so, just wind itself, so not solar, not wind, not biomass or geothermal. So that's pretty significant. So there's a huge potential for wind as an example, also biomass and solar, and the question is, where do you develop that? So let's go to the next slide very quickly here. Here's a little detail. I want to show you how we actually develop those high quality wind resources and go from what's called a full resource potential really to the developable potential, where developers are actually interested in understanding where can they target even a more sophisticated data collection that they need in order to take their project to get to the bank. So again, same region blown up. If we click through this is the total wind resource. And so now you have to exclude then essentially the suboptimal resource area, and that gives you then the high resource area, i.e. the most economic potential. If we click again, click one more time, so that's now in white. we're going to go through another one. So you don't want to also develop wind in your protected areas, right? Or in your cities, et cetera. So that's another layer that you have to exclude from calculating your wind potential. And that's now shown in gray, and then we'll click through, and that'll be white now, and then do one more time. Click again, please. Okay. So this is also important. So now you have to think about what are the economics in terms of getting to that resource. So again, remember that renewables are very site specific, and so you want to have actionable resource development areas. And so here you see actually areas that are excluded because they're further than 5 kilometers from an existing road, or they're further than 5 kilometers from an existing transmission line. And so this becomes then, I call it the attractive low-hanging fruit, high wind resource areas. So if we click one more time, you then see the final resource map here in the yellows and the reds. And that's kind of how you come about to understanding the developable resource potential. And that's what developers then use in order to target their site-specific selections, et cetera. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully there may be some questions, but let me turn now to our panels. And so I'm going to go off from a presenter's hat to a moderator's hat and introduce Carrie Thompson. So Carrie's the Deputy Assistant Administrator of USAID's Bureau for Economic Growth, Education, and Environment, and oversees the work of the Global Climate Change, Forestry, Biodiversity, and Land Tenure and Resources Management Offices.
That's a mouthful. It
is a mouthful. But it's really a pleasure to have her here on the panel, and she's going to describe a bit about USAID's role. Please.
Thanks very much, Doug. That was a great overview for all of us, and thanks for giving us the opportunity to talk about USAID's partnerships in the clean energy arena. And also, I'd like to thank my fellow panelists for joining us today in the side event to talk about your progress in accelerating renewable energy development. So thanks for that. Scaling up clean energy, as we all know, is a really essential part of low emission development around the world. And it's a key pillar also of USAID's work under the US Global Climate Change Initiative. We recognize, just as Doug laid out for us very clearly, the importance of identifying the best generation resources and the lowest cost generation locations in a country. This is a critical part of making renewable energy affordable at scale. As part of the Global Climate Change Initiative, the EC-LEDS project, or the Enhancing Low Emissions Development Strategy, and the LEDS Global Partnership Program, which is managed by our Department of State colleagues, is partnering with over 25 countries to plan for and achieve low emission growth. I'd like to recognize, of course, the great work that our Philippines partners are doing, and you'll hear more about that soon. The slide certainly shows more than 25 countries. It's the 25 that USAID is working with directly under our EC-LEDS program, plus the additional countries that are working in a diplomatic engagement with the State Department under the LEDS Global Partnership Program. So through our EC-LEDS program, USAID, the Department of State and Department of Energy's NREL are partnering with countries such as the Philippines, Bangladesh, and Mexico to identify renewable energy opportunities and to attract clean energy investments, all while reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector. With the cost, as we've all seen it, of renewable energy continuing to drop, more and more countries are seeing renewables as an opportunity to expand their energy portfolio and also to improve their energy security, while at the same time maintaining a low emission growth pathway. Key to this work has been developing the necessary data and information to map out where these resources lie and then to assess their potential for supplying clean power where it's most needed. What we hear from our in-country partners is how essential this information is to boosting private sector confidence. And that's a really critical thing for attracting investment and also for directing investment to areas of greatest opportunity. So I'll let my colleague from the Philippines talk about the great accomplishments they're making under our partnership there, but I'll highlight some of the work we're doing very briefly under two other partnerships. In Bangladesh, USAID and some of our U.S. government partners have been working with the Bangladesh Power Development Board and in-country manufacturers to support the installation of wind measurement systems in 9 locations around the country. These systems will collect wind data over 2 years, allowing the country to map and identify areas best suited for clean wind development and investment. Scaling wind deployment provides the opportunity for Bangladesh to meet its renewable energy goals. In Mexico, the second area partnership that I'd like to highlight, the U.S. is partnering with the National Autonomous University of Mexico, or UNAM, to develop high-quality solar data using satellite information that is then validated on the ground, which is a critical piece of it and sometimes not so easy to do. At the state level in Mexico, the ECLEDS program is also partnering with a local NGO in Campeche to identify opportunities for local wind development. This foundational information will be used by the government of Mexico to do 3 principal things: to study grid integration across the country, to develop renewable energy policies, and to establish renewable energy zones around the country. So it's been clear to us in our work under ECLEDS that partnering with in-country institutions like UNAM in Mexico, like the Philippines Climate Change Commission, and like the Bangladesh Power Development Board is really critical, and building their capacity and leveraging the relationships and technical expertise really is important in our work. So these are just a couple of examples of where USAID is supporting national and local governments to scale up renewable energy with the ultimate goal of fostering low-emission development around the world. We continue to recognize the importance of partnering with both public and private sector on developing this information that's needed to scale up investment in clean, low-emission energy technologies. So I look forward to hearing what the rest of the panel has to say on this critical building block of clean energy development. Thanks very much, and we look forward to your questions later.
Great. Thank you very much, Carrie. So it's, if you pass that to the next speaker. So it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathan Pershing. He's the Senior Advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Energy for Climate Change, and he serves as the Principal Deputy for the Department's Office of Energy Policy and Systems Analysis. And a little tidbit, Jonathan has been to every COP since the beginning. And wearing different hats as well. So it's really a pleasure to have you here. And can we have the next slide, please?
Thanks very much, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here. One of the things that's interesting to do at a meeting like this is to talk not just about the negotiating text, which is really the reason we have all gathered, but a bit to talk about the substance of what we're going to do about the implementation side. And I had the privilege of serving as the head of the U.S. negotiating team for the first term of the Obama administration. And I've moved to the Department of Energy in no small measure because I think this is where the next step is going to happen. We need to think about implementation. We need to think about how we translate the language on the paper of goals and commitments and expectations into the reality on the ground of a zero carbon energy infrastructure, and how do we think about the technologies and what's required to move them forward. The Department of Energy, which is where I now work, is at the center of that discussion domestically, although we also have a role on the international side. And I'll talk briefly about both pieces. The graph that you see here looks a little bit at a couple of different technologies, both at the price and at the volume of installed capacity in the United States. So on the top, what you've got is the installed capacity for wind. What you can see is the line is how much we've got installed, and the bars are the price. And you can see that price really declining very, very sharply over a period of time. On the right side, that same kind of graphic shows the deployment and the cost for solar panels. You can see where that goes. On the bottom is the same graphic for electric vehicles, and you can see where that goes. And then on the left side is light-emitting diodes, the LED lamps that we're now replacing all of our lights with. To me, this kind of technology pathway is going to be at the heart of our successful ability to really implement the agreements that we've come up with. I'd like to note that this is not exclusively something that applies in the United States, it applies globally. And while a wealthier country like ourselves may be willing to pay a slightly higher cost, realistically that doesn't sell in any community. Unless we can find a way to install zero-emitting capacity at a price that's as low or lower than the conventional capacities, we are not likely to do it at scale. You'll get a few people who want to pay a bit more, but the price has to come down to make this work. And that's a place where DOE has really been trying to lead in this overall arena. So we've got this very large capacity in our national laboratories. Doug represents one of those laboratories, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. But there are 17 DOE laboratories collectively employing about 100,000 people in the sciences community to really look at this next step in innovation, to think about how you drive these technology costs down, which in no small measure means inventing new ways to do business. Now, I would note that there are two parts to this. One part is the actual physical cost. That's the cost of producing the better turbine. That's the cost of the more efficient solar panel. But there's also a soft cost. That's the question of what does it take to train your people to install these things? What does it take to get the permit to put it on your roof, to make sure that when it operates, it's going to fit into the rest of your grid system? What does it take in the background to train your community to understand that this could have value and is not an unknown technology, but a realistic thing that you can install today, that it's credible, it's workable, it has economic potential, it's not just some newfangled thing that no one can adopt, but it's moving forward in the system. Those soft costs vary widely as well. One of the leaders on soft costs is Germany. The United States is really seeking to emulate its work in bringing those prices down. A solar panel made in China will have the same price around the world. We'll buy it for the same $2 as Germany buys it. But at the end of the day, Germany has half the price that we do for permitting and installation. A second set of concerns that you've got is the data. And Doug talked at some length about these, and they also apply globally. The ability to understand exactly how you fit this into your model, where it goes, not just for the project developer, but also for the institutional manager, for the utility that might be managing your electric system, for your village that's making a decision about where to install capacity, how much it might cost, what the long-term requirements for maintenance might be, and how to fit it into a larger energy picture. And I would note that I've shown here some of the images around the cost, but there are other benefits. There are security benefits. There are reliability benefits. There are benefits in terms of robustness. So let's take an example of a distributed generation system, like a solar panel or a solar structure or a wind system. You needn't be tied into the grid. So in the case of a country like the Philippines, but frankly like the United States as well, that experiences enormous storms called hurricanes or typhoons, depending on where you sit, and you end up with an isolated grid, can it still operate? How do you manage in that form, build resilience to make it work more efficiently and more effectively? The Department of Energy seeks to collaborate on all of these items. We work, as I mentioned, in the research field, but we also have people supporting USAID, supporting the Department of State, active in many, many countries around the world to try to bring our technical capacity into that larger community. We do it through a number of different mechanisms. One, we send people overseas. We are participants in many missions that the United States leads to bring our technical teams out to communities seeking to work on this. Two, we host people on a regular basis. Our laboratories bring in teams from around the world on a regular, daily basis. We have literally thousands of visitors from academic communities, from industrial communities, from businesses that are seeking to build these models and want to test their next generation. Our organization is set up in such a way to attract and to make those facilities available for our partners and our colleagues to help them figure out how to do this in a better way. We certainly draw on the collective resources of the US government in doing that. We don't operate in isolation. We work with state and AID and others who really have those connections. Our capacity is much more on the technical side. And I think that the things that we do domestically help us bring that message internationally. We are not seeking to say, it's good for you, but we don't do it that way. We're seeking at the other end to say, this is how we are trying ourselves to learn these lessons. We think we have similar circumstances. You may find these also relevant and useful. And I point to two different cases. One is one that we often don't think about. The United States has got a very large rural community, very, very significant populations that live in some isolation. I myself lived for a long time in the state of Alaska, quite far north, really an isolated community. And some of the work that we're doing there on individual islanded grids, mini grids and microgrids, is absolutely applicable in least developed countries. It is applicable in small island states. It's very constructive to think about how that translates, and the work we are doing there is work that we have in fact taken to other countries. A lot of work from Alaska now being used in the Caribbean. A lot of work in that interesting domain being applied in places like the Philippines. Real opportunities abound. And the second is on the policy side. Because as we think about this, it is not enough to merely look at the technology. You have to think about how the policy environment makes it work or may constrain it. So for example, many of our states are looking to promote renewables, and they do so through exercises like feed-in tariffs or renewable portfolio standards or incentives that are provided for tax credits to bolster and raise the level of investment at home. These too are areas we are trying to exchange information and where the data is requisite to understand how they work, how they perform going forward, what we can expect of these policies, so our collective policy makers, our elected government officials, have a good way to move this issue forward and to take advantage of the technologies as they roll out. I think there's a lot going on, a lot we can talk about. Some of these kinds of figures give you a sense of optimism about the direction that we're heading, but I think also a sense of the work that we can do going forward in meeting these long-term goals that we're setting in this process and implement them in a robust fashion. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much, Jonathan. I appreciate that. We'll come back to this theme of innovation and across the board, I think, in the Q&A question. But let me now introduce Jocelyn Goko, the Deputy Executive Director of the Philippines Climate Change Commission. She was formerly the head of the Interagency Committee on Climate Change and the Clean Development Mechanism Secretariat, and was instrumental in establishing the CDM designate national authority in the Philippines. And again, she's been part of the process for quite a while, and it's really a pleasure to have you here. Thank you. Can we have the next slide, please?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to express our appreciation to the U.S. government as well as to the USDOE, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, as well as the USAID for the support that they have provided in the development of this wind map, as well as the other tools that were provided to us and other methodologies that we also have made use in the development of our intended nationally determined contribution. So the Philippine government, in partnership with these different agencies, launched the 2014 Wind Atlas and Prospector for the Philippines and the Geospatial Toolkit. These tools represents the culmination of many years of collaboration between the Philippines and the U.S. government to develop a world-class data sets, models, and tools to support the clean energy development. These products also reflects a valuable cooperation we have had with the clean energy industry of our country as we work together to advance solutions that provide reliable, affordable, and environmentally sustainable energy that also advance our development objectives. The 2014 Energy Wind Atlas for the Philippines includes new detailed data sets and maps to support both government energy planning and industry investment in this emerging wind energy sector. The new resource map and tool generates high-quality wind data that will aid renewable energy developers in their ability to evaluate high-potential wind projects and policymakers to develop appropriate incentives based on more realistic market potential. This level of visualization and access to this data reflect cutting-edge capabilities that are found in only a handful of countries in the world. So we're one of those countries, and this was provided to us by the U.S. government in the development of this wind map. Similar to our leadership in the energy sector, the Philippines is leading the way in making key resource data and tools available to our industry partners, analysts, academia, and the individual citizen. In fact, these are uploaded in the Department of Energy website so that developers and prospectors could always use this, and somehow this would also help them reduce the cost in terms of prospecting the potentials, especially for renewable energy. The wind resource we have as gleaned from the updated wind map are so abundant that it lends full reality to the aspiration of the National Renewable Energy Program. If we are able to deploy the right and reasonable price technology in the next few years. On the other hand, the new Philippine Geospatial Toolkit is designed to facilitate the energy policy development, investment, and education by making high-quality data accessible and easy to understand. The tool creates user-friendly dynamic maps of renewable resources, including biomass, solar, and wind, and likewise displays renewable resources individually and in composite fashion. In fact, we are also looking at the possibility of overlaying the climate projections so that we'll also be able to see what will be the probable impact of extreme weather events that could probably happen if we do have these areas with potentials for the different renewable energy. And I think that will be coming soon. Mm-hmm. It is envisaged that both of these new tools and underlying data will play an integral role as the Philippines advances its domestic low-emission development activities in planning. In addition, I firmly believe that the wind prospectors and the GST will be valuable toolkits as the Philippines embarks on a strategic and well-crafted pathways towards the achievement of the aspirational greenhouse gas emission reduction scenario embodied in our intended nationally determined contributions.
Super. Thank you so much. So acronym was put in there, GST, that's the Geospatial Toolkit, which actually can be seen over in the tech corner later if you're interested. And what that does actually is it actually shows these maps, but it actually has a calculator built into it so that I don't have to remember all those numbers, but you can actually go in and zoom in on a little zone and actually calculate the potential of a given renewable energy technology for a given area, which is very, very useful both for prospecting, but also, as Joy mentioned, really about having the government confidence that they can achieve or even increase their ambition in renewable energies going forward. And I think that that's a really prime example of that. So let us go further here, and let me introduce Brad Johnson. He's the president of Resource Mobilization Advisors. He's got more than 30 years in project finance, so a lot of positive lessons and maybe a few negative ones that are always useful to talk about. And I think most importantly, he's also innovating on the finance side. And so he's going to please share with us some stories about how important data is to making a bankable project.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. Just a little bit about our firm. We were recently appointed the private sector observer to the Green Climate Fund. And this year we won the Bloomberg Finance for Resilience Award for our work in the Caribbean. As a private sector participant, I want to first of all thank USAID for the work that they do. Whenever we go into a country to do a project or put a financial program in place, one of the first meetings we schedule is with the USAID office to talk to their energy expert. I don't want to give away trade secrets, but they are a wealth of free information. And you hear all different kinds of stories. The developers say the banks don't know what they're doing. The bankers are saying the developers aren't bringing us projects. Usually there's something of truth in between, and we get that from USAID. So thank you for all the work you do. Also, thank you to DOE. You saw the maps that Doug put up. There's no private sector developer who can afford to do that kind of mapping. And there's no private sector developer who can provide that kind of information. So You talk about public-private partnership. There are two kinds of that partnership. One is specific projects. The city of Bogota wants to do a transit line. They do a concession. The private sector comes in, they negotiate. But there's also a conceptual public-private partnership, and I think DOE and USAID are examples of that, where they do the kind of work the private sector can't do, won't do. Private sector investors have very short attention spans, and USAID and DOE are in there for the long term. So thanks again for your work, and I'm happy to be here with Joy. We worked with her office on a construction guarantee finance facility for ANAMA, and I will say she has one of the best climate offices we've dealt with around the world, so I'm very happy to be here. From the private sector, you saw the maps, you saw the discussion. The work that's done by the labs and done by USAID is critically important to the small-scale developers. They're on the front lines of climate change. They're the guys who are knocking on your door in the Dominican Republic trying to sell you solar panels, or going to farmers and suggest they put up wind turbines. And they don't have a lot of resources. And they, quite frankly, don't have a lot of credibility. Someone comes and says, so install these solar panels and it'll pay for itself in 3 years. It almost sounds too good to be true. But they have a study that shows, here's a study, here's how it works, here's our technical analysis. And if you can say, it's not only our work, but look at this map that Doug produced, and then get down to the granular level. And you can see this site is in the right, where we want to put this project is in the sweet spot. So it's not just us. There's an independent, highly credible institution that has no profit motive that says this is the place to do this project. Extremely important to consumers, because you have to convince the consumers to do something they don't normally do. And so in terms of translating this technical analysis into real projects, it is extremely important. And in terms of the financing part of it, again, you go to local banks in a country and you say you want to do solar projects or wind projects, and you're a developer, your credibility on the technical side may not be terribly strong if you're doing the first or the third project. If you can go into that meeting with the bankers and show them some of the resource that DOE has provided, you can help educate them to the idea that this is the right site. This, trust my study is based on, again, an objective, highly regarded U.S. institution. So, and just in terms of translating all this to real results, this is extremely important information, and on behalf of the private sector, thank you for all that you do.
Thank you. That's great. We have about 15 minutes for some question and answer period, and so I have, of course, a moderator's prerogative of having a number of questions prepared, but I thought that I would first open it up to the floor and see what questions you all may have that any of the panelists could answer.
One second.
One sec.
There we go. And also ask your questions online, hashtag AskUSCenter, and we'll present those as well.
Good afternoon. My name is George Samarđe. I'm from Serbia, and we have already used some data produced by National Laboratory for Renewable. Okay, and yeah, thank you very much for your work. We used the online solar calculator for our investigation about 100% renewable energy scenario in Serbia. So I'm just thinking about this Philippine map is really detailed. Do you have similar data for whole world or just for some countries?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I guess I'll chime in here. We have detailed information for many countries, but not the whole world. So the key is and I think maybe just to show why, was the map where I showed biomass and wind and solar. If you remember back to that graph, the solar was quite pixelated. that was on a 30-kilometer resolution versus the wind, which was actually on a 1-kilometer resolution. And when you go to Brad's level, he wants it on a site. And so processing 1-kilometer resolution wind actually takes a lot of time, a lot of supercomputers, and a fair amount of money. Doing it for the whole world is a challenge. But with AID support and with other support, we've got a selection of countries. I think we're in the 50 range or so of countries. You'll see a whole list over here on the GST as well. But it is a challenge. Please.
There's also a project that's being done on an atlas for renewable energy, which is undertaken by a coalition supported in part by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory under the Clean Energy Ministerial and under IRENA. And that joint exercise has online the maps that are available currently. They are accessible, although as Doug has noted, a lot of those don't have the kind of resolution required for a specific site decision. Having said that, they certainly represent the first step. And it would let you decide, as you choose to move forward, where you might make the next level of evaluation and where those limited resources might be put that might have more value.
Okay,
Great.
other questions? Doug, maybe turn it to one of yours.
I will, sure. Carrie, might I, at this stage? So we've talked about some of the successes and the value of data to country partners. What are some of the challenges that are faced in trying to develop that?
Well, I think the last question alluded to some of it. Colleagues of mine who are working closely on this topic advise that there are kind of three areas of challenges, and one is certainly the limited availability of public data sets to have to upload onto the maps on the kinds of factors that can influence renewable energy potential, such as land cover and transmission lines. Hard to find in some countries. And somewhat related, and this is a second challenge, is in many of the countries we work in, sometimes there is limited cross-ministerial communication, and therefore it can pose a bit of a barrier to collecting the best data on the local information that we need on some of those topics. And then finally, I mentioned in the case of Mexico, I think validating the satellite information on the ground, validating modeled resource data with ground measurements can also be challenging. They require partnerships on the local level, and sometimes they require confidentiality agreements with developers to access the data from their measurement stations. So those are some of the challenges.
Great, thank you. Let me slip down. Are there any other questions before I keep going? Okay, or online?
Not yet.
Who checks online? Okay.
I do.
I'm going to skip down to Joy, and Joy, ask a question. Working with international partners is both very rewarding, but part of that collaboration is really training and capacity building of your own staff and teams, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about your experience there and about the importance of that being a component of the process going forward?
Yeah, that's very important, the capacity and development as well as training to sustain the knowledge. And also, while we do have this wind map now and and the Geospatial Toolkit, the problem is how are we going, if there is a necessity to update it, we don't have to go back always to whoever did it, but the reason why it's, we always emphasize that whenever there are tools that are available or methodologies that are available, there should be some capacitation of the relevant sectors as well. It's not only the government, but also the private sectors also should be part in the process, in the training as well as so that they will also have an appreciation of the use of the tools, especially not only for the private sector, but also for the energy planner as well as the decision makers, so that this could also be translated into layman's language, so that the policy makers could really understand the value of these resources.
Great. Pass that microphone to Brad if you would. And Brad, let me ask you a question. In addition to the resource information and the resource data that we've talked about that we know is critical, what other components are necessary for a private developer to really take a bankable project to a financier? And where does data fit into that as well?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm happy to be here at this geospatial facility. I had a lot of French wine last night, and I was in a geospatial condition. So I feel some connection here. A project finance has three components. First is the financial structure, which is you take all the risk in a project and you allocate risk to the various players, and the theory is you allocate risk to the player that's best able to handle that risk. Secondly, there's a technical analysis, which is what DOE provides. And I think the examples in Bangladesh and Mexico are great partnerships where you did the high level and then USAID came in and did the site-specific studies. That's a great partnership. But when you have that information about wind capacity or solar capacity, you then have to factor in what kind of panel are you using, what's its efficiency, what's the slant of the sun, and all that's the technical part. Then the financial part builds off that. So you say, well, there's the solar radiation of this level. We're using a panel with a 21% efficiency rating, and it's got a southern slant, and it produces very, very specific numbers you take to the bank, and you say, here's the capacity to repay this loan, or here's the internal rate of return for equity investors. The financial structuring part, the people in my business can do it. The financial analysis, there are people who can do it. What we really lack is the technical expertise that you bring to the table. So, but those are the three components, and again, the work you're doing is extremely helpful to us.
Super, thank you. Jonathan, if I may, I'm sorry.
We have a question from the floor
Okay.
whenever you're ready.
Please, go
Take it
ahead.
now? Okay.
Thanks, Ashley. Hi, this is Mariana Heinrich from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And I have two of you mentioning microgrids and remote electrification. And obviously that's a huge challenge in relation to climate change, and it is clearly necessary that business comes in and takes really the lead there in implementing projects, because 1.3 billion people are not going to be handled by government money. Now, we're currently working on a business solution that tries to help businesses more picking up the microgrid idea. And one thing that we're seeing is that there is market hesitation because the technology is there and the costs have been reduced, but nevertheless, and obviously finance is a problem, yes, but there's some sort of hesitation that the market is not really going in there. And I was wondering what your views were, why that is currently the case. Thank you.
It varies. It varies country to country. Some countries have a better policy framework, have better legal structure for doing financing, and you're therefore more inclined to go into those countries to do financing. You'll find that the countries that don't have sound policies are the kind of things that Joy and her colleagues work on. The countries without that are not attracting the foreign investment. The private sector, we have a very short attention span, and we go into a country, the second best answer we can get is no. And we're told no, we'll go somewhere else. But if we can be told yes, and we can have the certainty of the government policies behind those decisions and long-term policies, that probably is one of the major factors that drives investors into a country. And again, if it's off-grid, microgrids, you have to convince consumers this is going to work. The example of this is Solar City used to knock on people's door and say, buy this solar panel, and here's our study. It's going to pay for itself in 3 years. We're going to install it and leave. And most people are wondering, well, what happens? I can't use my remote control on my TV. Panel doesn't work, I'm stuck. There's a great New Yorker cartoon, the woman standing by the stove, and a guy behind her's on a ladder, and half his body is up in the attic, and she says, "Can Hiram call you back? He's fixing the solar panels right now." So when Solar City stepped in and said, "We're going to lease the panels. We'll do the upfront financing, no money up front. We'll assume the performance risk, technology risk. If the panel doesn't work, if the neighbor's baseball destroys a panel, we'll come fix it because it's us that will be damaged by this." They introduced solar leasing in August of 2008. Within 2 months, their market share tripled. So anything you can do to give consumer comfort to these kinds of technology, because you're asking people to do things they don't normally do, the policy framework and then a focus on the consumer are, I think, the two things that will drive financing to countries.
We've got time for one quick question, and I'm going to take the prerogative here. So, Jonathan, to you. The question is we've heard the importance of data at the beginning, but really, how do you feel data plays out in the policy-making process? And how important is it to continue to evolve and advance the data to align with the technology advances as well as the other policy advances that are taking place?
Thanks, Doug. I just want to come back before I do that to the comment that Brad just made in terms of the question on microgrids and mini-grids. It strikes me there's one other component that is probably relevant, and that has to do with the fact that it's an integrated technology process. In other words, if you're a common investor might go in and say, "I'm going to build a power plant," and doesn't worry about the transmission line. They may worry about the connection, but not the transmission system. Or you've got a transmission investor, and they're not really worried about the end user or the generation. The structure of the grid, and as we scale it down to the microgrids, therefore requires more integrated planning. And to me, that's an area that has not been as fully developed yet in the policy community. I think it's coming. We've got examples for it. But here I fully agree with Brad. You're not going to do one if you're the first. A lot of companies will say, I'll be the 10th guy in. You let me know when there's 9 other ones that I can look at, get my model, understand the costs, see where my value proposition lies, and then I'm with you. But I don't really want to do that first one. That's an awfully risky venture for my investors who are just not that risk tolerant. So I put that out there. On Doug, on your question on the data, I think this same thing may be an interesting analogy to use to think about how you draw this out. So here's a case on the microgrid where I have to have the following kinds of information. I need to have a demand curve. I need to know exactly who's got the requirements, what they intend to use it for, because that will dictate what kind of generation mix I have to have. I therefore need to know from the generation mix what might supply that. Do I need 24/7 power? Do I have a shoulder load? What am I thinking about in terms of peak capacity? Do I have a backstop supply that might come from some other source? How much can it provide in? What are the costs of that? What's my tariff and rate structure? Does that allow me to build in some peak demand requirements in terms of my pricing? How do I then take all of that information and translate it into the availability of a technology that might meet this incremental load, or a new technology that might replace the existing load? I've got a site. Is the site in the right location? I've got the location in the site. What are my options for purchasing? Do I have a technology that might be at 30 meters or at 100 meters? How do I think about the integration of that technology with my existing network? How does that technology play out in terms of multiple providers? Who do I have who's going to provide that information, and do I trust them? How do I take all of that information and put it into a business plan and bring it to the bank? And when I bring it to the bank, what will they believe, and what will they need me to show them to guarantee a return on my investment? Every single one of these requires data. I can't go to the bank without it. I can't go to the power producer without it. I can't go to my city council without it. I can't go to my ratepayer without it. That kind of information is therefore a prerequisite. And I think the kinds of things we've all been talking about here generate at each stage the kinds of required data that can inform the decisions that let us make these transitions.
Great, thank you very much, Jonathan. We just about out of time. I think I'd like to just make a couple of key points in terms of the importance of data, and also recognize our good partners at NOAA, who of course provide a lot of the satellite information. Thank you very much, Sandy and company, that go into much of this resource mapping, and I think that's a very critical role. So kind of back to the last slide, if you will, it's just back to the circle that I showed at the beginning, which is really data at the center of this. And no need to really repeat that what we've just gone through for an hour, but I think it's really important to understand that high quality data is very important not only for the policy process, but for the implementation process and for every step between the first one and the nth one, and to recycle that, particularly as technologies continue to advance. And I think most importantly, it's really this piece about public-private partnerships. It's about providing data with USAID support and with others working together that really bring this high-quality, non-commercial, verifiable data set to the whole decision-making process, particularly the policy process, but also the investment process. So thank you for your attention. Could you join me in thanking the panelists, please?